What I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is more about the New Testament prophet and how we go about prophecy, where we get things from God, because that's quite important. You know, is it us speaking or is it God speaking? How do we know the difference? And I want to examine Moses a bit, first of all, because Moses was an important prophet in the Old Testament. He was one of the greatest Old Testament prophets. And we're going to look at the importance of coming to God and turning aside when you notice something. And everybody knows the story of Moses, how he went up to the mountain of God and God said, take 2 tablets. And I think it was the first and the only time that man got a headache of having taken 2 tablets instead of being relieved. I know.
That was awful.
That's a bad joke. Okay. And what happened with Moses is, in Exodus 2, he kills the Egyptian, he runs away, he meets and marries his wife, he settles down into a nomadic lifestyle, shepherding sheep, having had an amazing lifestyle in Egypt. I mean, I cannot imagine what that changeover was like in his life. But he was demoted, and it's interesting the number of people who that happens to, Joseph and other people in the Bible. And when he arrived at Midian, I'm sure on a clear day he saw Mount Sinai in the Far East, and he asked about it. And it's one of the most visible landmarks in the Sinai Peninsula. I've been in the Sinai Peninsula region, and there's a passage in George Muller's story which makes this clear. And what it says is we're going to pass the place where Moses received the 10 Commandments tomorrow morning. Yes, sir, that was Sinai, wasn't it? Have you been in the Suez Canal before? They were coming down the Suez Canal at the top. No, but I'd like to see the mountain. Well, you'd have to be up at 4 o'clock. I will, sir. Where would it be? It'll be over on the right, the starboard, as we head up the Red Sea. It's 7,000 feet high, so it's a big mountain. How near would it be? It'll be 120 miles inland, but the sun's going to be shining on it, with the rest of us in darkness, and it'll look much closer. And I'm sure at dawn, on quite a few occasions, he looked at that mountain. And I can imagine him chatting with his father-in-law, Jethro, who was a priest of Midian. And I'm sure the conversation went like, what's that mountain over there, Jethro? Oh, that's horrible, that's the mountain of God. Have you been there? Yeah, I've been there over the years. Oh, the true God can be encountered there. And Jethro's other name was Reuel. And what Reuel means is friend of God. So I really believe that Moses' father-in-law was a man of God. And I'm sure that he had encounters of God on this mountain, and he probably told Moses about them. But it took Moses 40 years wandering around in the wilderness. And so Moses is out in the wilderness, shepherding his sheep, and he decides to lead his flock to the west side of the wilderness. And he comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. That's Exodus 3, verse 1. And Moses, having probably known about the mountain for all that time, he finally decides to go there and seek God. You see, he'd been a man in hiding after sinning. And we were talking about that this morning, how we can hide for years on end in our sin and not really come to the true God and be his friend. And that can separate us from God and our friendship from God, our sin. And when he arrives, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire. Yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvellous sight, why the bush is not burned up. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush. And he said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. And that word turn aside is repeated twice, and Hebrew never makes a mistake. It always emphasizes something. And the Hebrew for turn, or turn aside, is sur. And it's a very strong word. It shows strong intent and purpose in it. And it's illustrated in 1 Kings 22, verse 32. So when the captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat, they said, "Surely that's the king of Israel." And they turned aside and pursued him to fight against him. And Jehoshaphat cried out, and when they saw the chariots, and it wasn't the king of Israel, they turned back from pursuing him. So what it means is that to turn aside, to chase after something, to really pursue it. And it was almost as if God was waiting for Moses to come to the mountain so that he could notice the sign that he'd set up there and give him the angel's message. In Deuteronomy 33, verse 16, it talks about Moses and the favour of him who dwelt in the bush. And that Hebrew word for dwelt is Shechem. And that has a connotation of somebody who settles down, who abides. So it's as if the angel had been abiding, dwelling in that bush, waiting there for God, for Moses to come to God. And he'd be camping out there saying, "Come on, Moses, come to the mountain of God." And I'm sure God's like that with us. He's waiting for us to turn aside and pursue him. And it's when Moses saw something different, he turned aside, he paid full attention to it, that God spoke to him. And this is one of the reasons he learned to recognize the form of the Lord. And in Numbers 12, 6 to 8, it says, "If there is a prophet of the Lord among you, I shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak to him in a dream. Not so with Moses, my servant. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings, and he beholds the form of the Lord." And the word "behold" here, what it means is it's called nabat in the Hebrew, and it means to consider, to gaze, to pay attention and regard. You gaze at something, you look at it and you study it. And in Exodus 33:11 it says, "Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend." And the Hebrew word for face is pena, and it's often translated presence. And it's in Genesis, you remember when Adam and Eve hid? They hid themselves from the presence of the Lord. So they hid themselves from the face of the Lord. And the root of this word is pana, and it means to turn. So what we've got to do is we've got to be active to turn to God, to seek something from God in order for God's presence to come to us. And in the New Testament it talks about this, and it talks about the church at Corinth who are not lacking in any gift. And yet Paul still encouraged them to earnestly desire the greater gifts. That's 1 Corinthians 12:31. And in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul tells them to pursue love, yet desire earnestly spiritual gifts, but especially that you may prophesy. And that Greek word for earnestly desire is zelio. It's what we get zealot from. And it could be translated to zealously or to lust after, almost. And God is talking about spiritual gifts in that way. And that's what Moses did. He turned aside, he went with purpose, he went with direction, he went with force towards that burning bush. He may have seen it many times before in the distance or something. But he makes his mind up and he goes, "I want that. Okay, I've been hiding from God, I'm going to go and get him. I want to meet with God." And God desires that from us. If we want to move in the prophetic, And I cry out to God. I've been crying out to God this week. I've been saying, oh God, come on, speak to me. I'll just say something. And do you do that? I mean, if you want the prophetic, that's what you need to do. To actually move in it well. And